All right, let's dive in. We're about to go on a super fast journey through the conflicts that literally built the United States. We're talking everything from colonial clashes to a war that almost tore the entire country apart. This is the story of how a nation was made, not just with big ideas, but on the battlefield. So, let's get started. That's a pretty heavy question, right? But if you really want to understand America's power today and where it might be headed, you have to go back. You have to understand how it became this global giant in the first place. And that story, well, it's rooted in centuries of conflict.
So our story really kicks off here. You've got a continent that was anything but empty. In fact, it was the stage for this massive three-way struggle for control between ancient native societies, these really ambitious European empires, and the colonists who were kind of caught in the middle of it all.
Now, just look at the scale of time here. It's kind of mind-blowing. For thousands and thousands of years before Columbus even showed up, complex civilizations were rising and falling all across this land. Heck, even the Vikings dropped by for a bit, a full 500 years before the discovery. So this wasn't a new world at all. It was just new to Europeans.
And after 1492, it was like a frantic race. You have these European powers, Spain, France, England, and they're just carving up the continent, drawing lines on maps that completely ignored the hundreds of thousands of people who already lived there. Every single one of those claims was basically an invitation for a fight down the road.
And this just shows you how incredibly tough it was to get a foothold here. The first big English attempt at Roanoke, well, the entire colony just vanished. Poof, a total failure. It wasn't until Jamestown, more than 20 years later, that they finally managed to stick around through sheer brutal persistence, and that set the stage for a permanent English presence. Jamestown's survival really came down to a single cash crop, tobacco. But that success created this bottomless need for labor. And so, just 12 years after its founding, we hit this profound turning point. The first enslaved Africans are brought to Virginia. This single event bakes a deep moral contradiction right into the colonial project, a clash between the dream of freedom and the grim reality of bondage that is going to haunt the nation for centuries. For almost 100 years, North America was basically a giant chessboard for European empires. I mean, these weren't just little skirmishes, they were world wars fought on American soil. The last one, the French and Indian War, left Britain in charge of the continent, but also with a mountain of debt. And you gotta remember that debt, because it's the critical link to our next chapter. See, Britain had a very clear idea of who was gonna help pay it off: the American colonists.
And just like that, the debt from one war becomes the spark for the next. This is the story of how the colonists turned against their own mother country and, maybe even more importantly, how they fought with each other to figure out what this new nation was even supposed to be.
You know, the breakdown happened incredibly fast. In just 10 years, you go from simple trade rules to direct taxes to soldiers firing on civilians in the streets of Boston. And when Parliament tries to punish them, it just backfires and unites the colonies. Every single step just pushed them further down the road to an inevitable breakup. And then, this happens. This is the moment a rebellion becomes a full-blown revolution. These words weren't just a way to start a war. They were a declaration of a whole new idea, a radical, world-changing idea of liberty and rights that this new nation would spend the rest of its existence trying, and often failing, to live up to.
Actually, winning the war was, well, a long shot to say the least. Washington's surprise attack in '76 literally saved the cause from collapsing. Then, the incredible victory at Saratoga convinced France to jump in, and that was the real game changer. Finally, at Yorktown, with the French Navy blocking the escape route, they trapped the main British Army and sealed an unbelievable victory.
But, winning the war is one thing. Winning the peace is a whole other beast. Their first shot at a government, the Articles of Confederation, was a complete disaster. It was just too weak. States were doing their own thing. It was chaos. The founders realized they had to scrap it and start over, designing the Constitution to create a strong, stable federal government that could actually, govern.
But even that brilliant new Constitution couldn't solve the nation's original sin. And that brings us to the third and bloodiest act of this story: the fight over slavery. This was a conflict that would pit brother against brother and push the Union to its absolute breaking point.
Just take a look at this. By 1860, the number of enslaved people was enormous. This was not some minor issue on the sidelines. It was a massive economic engine woven deep into the social fabric of the entire South. The nation wasn't just divided. It was fundamentally two different countries living under one flag.
And for decades, politicians tried to dodge the inevitable. Every single one of these compromises was just a political band-aid. They were trying to keep the number of slave and free states balanced as the country pushed west. But they weren't solving the problem. They were just kicking the can down an ever shorter road.
This is it. This is the moment the talking stops and the shooting starts. They came up with this idea of popular sovereignty, which sounded nice. Let the settlers in new territories vote on whether to allow slavery. But instead of a peaceful vote, it lit a powder keg. Pro- and anti-slavery settlers flooded into Kansas to rig the outcome, and it turned into a brutal, bloody proxy war. The Civil War had basically begun.
You know, on paper, this war should have been over in a few months. The Union had way more people, way more factories, a real navy, pretty much more of everything. But the Confederacy was fighting a defensive war on their home turf, and they had a really strong military tradition. That made the conflict so much longer and deadlier than anyone ever imagined.
What Lincoln does here, it's a moral and strategic masterstroke. It completely transforms the war. Suddenly, it wasn't just about holding the country together anymore. It was now a war to end slavery. Period. This reframed the entire conflict for the rest of the world and crucially allowed black soldiers to enlist, adding vital manpower to the Union Army.
The cost of that war was just staggering. Over 600,000 lives lost. That's more Americans than died in World War I and World War II combined. It was a horrifying, brutal conflict that left scars all over the nation. But from those ashes, it forged a new, single, indivisible country.
Or did it? In our final section, we're going to look at what came next. Okay, the war's over, the Union is saved, slavery is abolished. But was the conflict really resolved? This period, called Reconstruction, was the attempt to answer that very question.
In this incredible burst of progress, the Constitution was fundamentally rewritten. 3 amendments get passed that don't just end slavery, they promise citizenship, equal protection under the law, and voting rights to millions of newly freed African Americans. It was a revolutionary promise of a totally new, more inclusive America.
But that promise was met with a campaign of pure terror. White supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan sprang up all across the South. Their goal was simple: use violence and intimidation to stop Black Americans from voting and to reestablish total white control. The fight for the soul of the South was far from over.
And this is how it all ended. Not with a bang, but with a shady, backroom political deal. To settle a disputed presidential election, the federal government agreed to pull its troops out of the South. And just like that, Reconstruction was over. The promise was broken, and the door was thrown wide open for a century of legal segregation and oppression known as Jim Crow.
So, we end right back where we started, with a nation defined by its conflicts. The Civil War answered the question of whether the United States would be one nation or two, but it left behind an even deeper question, one that, frankly, Americans are still wrestling with today. What does that one nation actually stand for? And what does it truly mean to be indivisible?